We're going to talk to Cliff May this hour from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. You'll remember Cliff. He spent a long time in Denver, wrote a column at the Rocky Mountain News, was on our station a lot, filled in for me. Also, he'd worked at the New York Times, and now he's the executive director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, an excellent piece by Rael Mark Geert and Mark Dubowitz, two of the specialists on foreign affairs at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, about the Iranian nuclear deal that President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry are trying to work out, as terrible as it is. And we'll get into the details of that. But before that, Cliff, are you with us?
I am indeed, sure.
I thought I might draw you out on the latest statements of Pope Francis, who was visiting in Bolivia with Evo Morales, who's the president, and a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist revolutionary. We seem to have an anti-capitalist Marxist Pope Francis, and it's not surprising since he has a Jesuit background, and the Jesuits have always been the intellectual left-wing vanguard of the Catholic Church. Evo Morales, as a matter of fact, photographed with the Pope, was wearing a jacket with the image of Che Guevara on it while he stood aside the Pope. I'm sure you're familiar with the Pope's comments. What's your reaction?
Yeah, and of course, perhaps most, I guess, infamously, Evo Morales presented a crucifix in the shape of a hammer and sickle. And the Pope, the pontiff, to his credit, did not say, "Thank you very much. Can I have another?" He took offense at it. I think he made that pretty clear. Look, if you know anything about the history of communism, you know that it believes that religion is the opium of the masses. And Stalin, when at one point presented with opposition from the Pope, asked how many divisions he has. The idea that communism is conducive to religiosity and to the church is very, very far-fetched. But as you also say, there is, and there has been for years since I was covering parts of Latin America, something called liberation theology, which is the Catholic Church leaning as far left as it possibly can.
And liberation theology is something that Karl Marx would be very comfortable with. So when we talk about...
I'm not sure. He would probably say that. I think he would view those in favor of liberation theology, Marx would, and certainly Lenin would, as useful idiots.
Fair enough.
As a Leninist phrase.
I'm saying while we talk about systems of political economy, and while there's a version of democratic socialism in Scandinavia and much of Europe, for example, the Soviet brand, and they called it socialism, incidentally. That's where the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics comes from. It can be equated with a totalitarian one-party police state, but it doesn't have to be. The underlying premise, however, of from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, is pure Marxism, and that seems to be something that this Pope is comfortable with.
And many people on the left are, and in this country as well. The idea of that inequality of outcome is a major problem that the government needs to address. That suggests exactly that from each... Look, there's two phrases here. One is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That would be communism. Then there's from each according to his ability, to each according to his deed, which is socialism, which suggests that, if you work twice as long or you're twice as productive, you do benefit to a greater extent than somebody else. But the government, at the end of the day, that they will decide how much of what you earn belongs to you, and how much they should redistribute to others to whom they think have a better claim.
Well, the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, is, and it sounds like you're being more diplomatic than I am not at all pleased with this Pope's take on political economy and certainly on economics.
I agree with you on that. I think it was good that he drew the line when he got the crucifix in the shape of a hammer and sickle. I do think he is misguided in what he is saying about the world economy. He doesn't understand the need for growth and how growth helps everybody. And I also understand, but I'm not thrilled by the fact that he has paid scant attention to the fact that Christian communities are being annihilated on his watch throughout the Middle East. There may not be any Christian communities 20 or 30 years from now, and this does not seem to be nearly as much of a concern to him as does climate change and income inequality.
All right, let's talk about the Iranian nuke deal. Even Kerry is getting frustrated, apparently. We are certainly up against some hardline negotiators in Iran who are not desperate for the deal in the same sense that we are desperate, and by we I mean Obama and Kerry. Give us your take on the current status of it, and then let's talk about that piece in the Wall Street Journal that was authored by a couple of experts at your organization, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. And tell us about the two players who wrote that piece first.
Well, Ruan Markarek is a very interesting character. He was an Iran's targets officer in the Directorate of Operations of the CIA for many years. So he speaks Farsi, speaks Arabic, speaks Turkish, speaks French. I sometimes say he speaks all the major Islamic languages, and he has been studying in great granularity and detail the Iranian regime for many, many years, a country he can't go to. Neither can Mark Dubowitz. Mark comes from a different background. He is probably the foremost expert on economic warfare and sanctions policy in any think tank and perhaps anywhere else in this town. And they collaborated on this piece. And the basic thesis of the piece is, even if we get an agreement here, the belief that this agreement prevents war is wrong. And what it actually does is it probably paves the path to a war at a time when Iran is going to be much, much stronger and may indeed have nuclear weapons and the means to deliver it. One of the anomalies of these negotiations, and it's very strange, is that the Iranians say, we do not have a nuclear weapons program, but we do have an ICBM program. Well, the only purpose for an intercontinental ballistic missile, the only purpose is not to put a monkey in space, it's to deliver a nuclear warhead to a target on another continent, like here. And yet the negotiators have not said, so shut down your ICBM program if you're saying you don't have, don't need, don't want, and are not building nuclear weapons. You don't need an ICBM program, but that's not even been part of the negotiations.
As bad as this deal is, and as unlikely that the Iranians are to abide by it, there's a certain amount of irony here, because your two experts, in essence, are saying that it may be a good thing down the road when it's clear that the Iranians did not honor this agreement if we signed this deal, because it will give the next American president much greater standing to react militarily if that's necessary, precisely because we attempted diplomacy first.
One thing that's going to be clear is that all diplomatic options will have been exhausted. And as much as President Obama likes to say, it's either this agreement, bad or good as it may be, I think very bad, or it's war, and I don't actually buy into that, but some people do. The fact of the matter is that the United States democratic societies generally do not use military force until they have exhausted all other options, and the diplomatic option is being depleted very rapidly as you describe it, as we see even Secretary Kerry seeming to be saying, I just can't go as far as I'm being pushed, because what keeps happening is that the Iranians, every time they get a concession, instead of saying, okay, that's great, you've given us a lot, let's sign on the dotted line, they say, you know what, if we can get one concession, can't we get another and another and another? And it goes back to the old Leninist saying that if you are probing with your bayonet and you hit mush, you should continue to move forward. You only retreat when you hit steel. And maybe at this point, the Iranians think they hit steel, but maybe not. There's one other thing to say, and that is that the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, the guy who's really in charge, the basis of the revolution that he has led since the death of his predecessor 26 years or so ago, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, is death to America. This revolution is based on anti-American animus. I think Obama would like to believe he is getting ready for a Nixon to China moment, but I'm going to bet you a dollar, Mike, that even if agreement is signed, the Supreme Leader will not say, now I want to see Obama in my office, drink some pomegranate juice, propose a toast and sit for a chat. I don't think he can do that. He thinks America is Satan incarnate, and he thinks that Obama represents Satan.
All right, let's take a break here. I sent you a piece that Greg Dobbs had in the Denver Post yesterday as well. You got that, did you not? I want to talk about that because there's a certain irony to the conclusions that both your folks and Greg Dobbs reached, but for different reasons. And we'll get into the nuances of that. 713-8585, our telephone number.
NMLS 182334, regulated by the Division of Real Estate.
I've been telling you about my friends at American Financing for some time now. They're sponsoring this hour of my podcast. Work with salaried loan officers, get pre-approved in an hour, close in as fast as 8 days. 303-695-7000 or online at AmericanFinancing.net. Cliff May, our guest, head of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. We're talking about the Iranian nuclear deal between the United States and other countries are on board with this as well, some of which are salivating over the prospect of doing business once again with Iran. I sent you that piece by Greg Dobbs. You know Greg. You were here when Greg was working at KOA as well. I like Greg. He's left of center, but he's not a flaming liberal. He's a reasonable guy. And his assessment was that this deal, flawed as it is better than no deal at all, because without a deal, we wouldn't be able to buy time during which we could keep at least half an eye on Iran's bomb-building abilities. Now, I see little value, incidentally, in buying time if your assumption, and it is mine and I think yours, is that Iran is hell-bent on getting a nuclear weapon, and they're looking at the long haul, measured in decades and centuries. So a few years wouldn't bother them if, by the way, they abide by this agreement and slow down their timetable, which I don't necessarily assume they will. And Greg is also saying that we really don't have a military solution, only a military option, which he thinks would be unsuccessful because a lot of their production facilities are deep underground or diversified in different locations, and we really couldn't knock them out with a weapons, a military attack. I say the irony here is that your experts think that a deal is better than no deal at all because it sets the stage for a military option if we need it later on. Give me your compare and contrast on that.
Well, I think the phrase buying time is interesting because right now under the interim agreement we're buying time and it's costing us about $700 million a month that we're supplying to this regime that it can utilize for terrorism, that it can utilize to support Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthi rebels and to the oppression of their own people. If we go through this deal as currently envisioned, there'd be about $140 billion going to Iran. Now, this is an extraordinary sum of money for that country, and would be. And there are those who say, no, I'm sure they're going to use it to buck up their public health system. I'm sure they're going to use it for clinics. Even if they use a small portion of it for terrorism, and people forget. This is the leading sponsor of terrorism in the world, according to the U.S. government, among others. Thousands of Americans have been killed and maimed by Iranian agents, starting in 1983 in Beirut, and the use of not just IEDs, but something a lot more dangerous, the explosively formed penetrators in Iraq that came in from Iran, and that's what was used to terrible effect against our troops. The IEDs were not so dangerous. The explosively formed penetrators were maimed and killed a lot of our people. So we're going to be. I mean, if part of the way I say it is, if back in 2001, after the attacks, I had written a column for the Rocky Mountain News or wherever I was, saying I think within 15 years we will give the leading sponsor of terrorism billions of dollars. And two pathways to a nuclear weapon, and this is an important thing to understand. If the Iranians do abide by the agreement as we now see it, they will be welcomed into the nuclear club within about a decade, a little bit more, fully allowed to come in, even if their behavior hasn't changed, even if they're still the leading sponsors of terrorism. If they cheat on the agreement, I agree with you, that's more likely based on past experience, including very recent past experience. They've cheated on the interim agreement, then they could develop nuclear weapons a lot more quickly than that.
Now, let me stop you there for a second, because they've already told Kerry in the recent negotiations, which is why he's so frustrated, that an earlier compromise on allowing inspections is not going to be honored by them.
Well, they say, you're not going to look. You're not going to. The only kind of inspections that really work. This idea, we'll keep half an eye on them. What does that even mean? The only way that you have really good inspections, if your inspectors, which are international UN inspectors, can go anywhere, anytime. If they can say, I know you want to go to that facility. Maybe we can schedule something in about 3 weeks. Right now is just not a good time for us. What do you really think you're going to see that they don't want you to see?
Yeah, they're going to say, oh, wait, it's being painted right now. The wallpapers are coming in next Thursday.
That's exactly right. So you really aren't going to know what they're doing, and they know how to cheat. The idea that they still do not admit the truth, which we know, which is they have a nuclear weapons program. You don't build an electricity program under a mountain. I mean, there's no reason for it. You don't need a plutonium path for electricity production. You don't need ICBMs, as we discussed in the earlier segment, if you're just creating electricity. They won't admit that. I understand you say, well, it's face-saving. We don't want them to admit that. We don't need for them to admit that. We just need to know that they're not moving ahead with it. But under the deal as now envisioned, we would not know. And part of the problem is that, and this is holding things up, the Iranians want the rewards up front. They want all the goodies first, and then you can see maybe if they're complying. And the negotiators are trying to say, no, as we see compliance, then you will get money and then you will get other goodies as part of this agreement. We don't want to give it to you all first. And the Ayatollah is essentially saying that's not how we want it. This has been unfair to us from the beginning. You have victimized us. We want you to lift these sanctions and other sanctions, by the way, as well. Sanctions from the UN on the ICBMs, even though they weren't part of these negotiations. There are some sanctions for our terrorist activity. Lift it all. Say it was all a mistake. And then we'll say we're complying with everything you've asked us to do, whether we are or not.
Hold that thought. We need to take our bottom of the hour news break. I wanted to posit, by the way, they have an explanation for the ICBMs regarding electrical production. They're going to use that to deliver the electricity bills. That's why they need the ICBMs. But the question I want to leave with you, and you raised this in your last piece, what can members of Congress do right now? If this is an executive agreement between Obama and Iran, it doesn't require Senate ratification. We'll get to that when we come back.
NMLS 182334, regulated by the Division of Real Estate.
I've been telling you about my friends at American Financing for some time now. They're sponsoring this hour of my podcast. Work with salaried loan officers, get pre-approved in an hour, close in as fast as 8 days. 303-695-7000 or online at AmericanFinancing.net. Cliff May with us, head of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We're talking about the nuclear weapons deal with Iran, which guarantees that they'll have them in 10 to 15 years, which certainly wasn't the premise for earlier rounds of negotiations. This is a fait accompli that the Obama administration is apparently willing to settle for, not clear why. So what can Congress do about this, if anything?
Well, they can. The most important thing is to start off with is simply a very clean, clear-cut resolution of disapproval. Now, almost all the Republicans are on board for that. The Democrats are getting tremendous pressure, not just from the White House, but from various left-wing groups saying if you don't vote to support this president on this important diplomatic initiative, we'll primary you, we'll come after you, we'll make you very, very sorry. But that's what I think we'd like to see first. And even if it's vetoed, even if they don't get enough for a veto, it would send a very important statement that the members of Congress and their constituents, a majority, are not in favor of a bad deal. They agree with what President Obama used to say, which is that a no deal is better than a bad deal. Now, if the Congress were to prevail on this, then it would be impossible for President Obama to lift some of the sanctions unilaterally. Some he can, but others he can't, and that would block the deal. But then, of course, they'll be accused of caving the deal, of killing the deal, and they'll say, you're a warmonger, see what you've done. But Congress needs to express itself on this issue. I think that this deal is important enough that it should be submitted as a treaty, and that would require two-thirds of the Senate to approve it. But President Obama said, nope, it's not a treaty. It's not binding. It's simply an executive agreement. I don't need congressional approval. But Congress has insisted on having a say, and they should have that say. It will take 60 votes in the Senate to get cloture, which means to get a vote on approval or disapproval. And I think there may be some Democrats who will say, well, we should vote on it, even though I'm going to vote for the president, not against the deal.
The existing sanctions recipe was passed by Congress, correct?
It was indeed. There were some sanctions by the president. For the most part, the president was against sanctions and kind of reluctantly went along. I would argue that sanctions, when they got to be approaching the level of being crippling, brought Iran to the table. But then a lot of the sanctions pressure, not all of it, but a lot of it, was relieved in exchange for the interim agreement, the joint plan of action.
Since Congress imposed the sanctions, there's no expiration date on that imposition of sanctions, is there?
Theoretically, it should be Congress that lifts the sanctions, and Congress would have to do that.
I'm just the reason I'm asking. I'm wondering if Obama can make some claim that the sanctions will expire and that he doesn't need congressional approval to put them back in place.
Well, what he can say is, I have waiver authority for national security purposes on the sanctions, but he may not be able to do that based on the most recent legislation, particularly if Congress just disapproves of the deal. Then I think he would have a very difficult time exerting what he would call his waiver authority.
Now, the hope is that if we were dealing with a rational enemy, and let's make no mistake about it. Iran regards the United States as an enemy. That's why they say death to America. If we don't regard them as an enemy, we're kidding ourselves. But in any event, if you're dealing with a rational enemy, like the Soviet Union was vis-a-vis the United States, they might respond rationally to economic pressure. But as your two experts, Grecht and Dubowitz, noted, this is a revolutionary Islamic movement, and such a regime, by definition, would never bend to America's economic coercion and never gut its nuclear centerpiece, the nuclear centerpiece of its military planning for 30 years, and allow Westerners full and transparent access to its nuclear secrets and personnel. So their ideology, their religious ideology, their theocracy trumps everything else.
I think that's true up to a point. I think that there is a point at which they do not. The revolution is most important and the regime is most important. And if they thought either of those were seriously in question, I think they might be willing to strategically retreat. Think of what happened at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. And the Ayatollah, I think this was the previous Ayatollah, said, I have to drink from the poison chalice. In other words, I can't continue this war against Iran because it could lead to the death of my regime, and that's the worst thing that can happen. I happen to believe that we will never know, perhaps now, whether or not we could have changed the course of this regime, at least temporarily, but for a long time, by saying, look, we are going to cripple your economy with the toughest sanctions you can imagine, and we are going to credibly threaten to use military force if you don't back off. We are not going to let you have nuclear weapons. You have to understand that. You may think that's unfair. We are saying we're not going to. We're going to use sanctions and military force if we have to. And we could do both of those things. They've invested a huge amount of time and money and energy in their nuclear facilities. The idea that the United States might come in and set them back and bomb them, or that Israel might, that could cause them to say we have to back off for now. Because one of the concepts of Islamists in general, you see with Hamas as well, is they can't surrender, then they can't compromise, and they can't make peace. But they can have what in Arabic is called a hudna, which is a truce, which allows you to develop your capabilities rather than be beaten by your enemies.
Now, they did sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, did they not, Iran?
They did indeed, but I think they have violated it repeatedly.
Certainly they have. It's one thing if they think the United States has the capability to impose its will based on military action, but I suspect that they gather that the United States doesn't have the will to do it, certainly with this president.
I think they absolutely know that and have known that all along. They've known that even when President Obama was saying all options are on the table, the military option never was on the table for him. Ayatollah Khamenei, the current supreme leader, remembers the quote of Ayatollah Khomeini, the first supreme leader, when our diplomats were being held hostage, and we did nothing about it under the Carter administration. And his quote was, the Americans can't do a damn thing. Now, you recall that they released those hostages as Reagan was coming into office, I believe because they thought Reagan may do a damn thing, and we don't want that. And I think that also is a precedent you could use. If they think that their regime, their power is in jeopardy, then they will make some compromises, but they won't do it for any other reason. They won't do it because they want to be part of the international community singing Kumbaya with Secretary Kerry, who should think of them as a partner for peace. That's not where they're at. They have a real revolution. They're real revolutionaries. It's a theologically based revolution. It is based on the idea that American power is a force for evil in the world and must be destroyed, and they want to establish something akin to a caliphate, another great Persian empire in the Middle East, and that's only to start with. And
they're
that's
also
part of why Israel is so worried about them. Saudi Arabia is so worried about them. The United Arab Emirates are so worried about them. All understand they have these hegemonic imperial ambitions.
They're also watching Obama downsize the U.S. military. What a message that
time
sends.
to downsize the military. When China is upsizing it, when Russia is taking over various parts of Eastern Europe and reestablishing a Russian empire, this is just not a good time to be downsizing your military.
All right. We'll take one more break. When we come back, in that Greg Dobbs piece, he believes that we don't have the military capability, given how securely buried these facilities are, to take them out, nor does Israel. Is that debatable or not? Do we have the capability of actually using some kind of an attack to take those weapons development sites out? Right back on 850 KOA.
NMLS 182334, regulated by the Division of Real Estate.
I've been telling you about my friends at American Financing for some time now. They're sponsoring this hour of my podcast. Work with salaried loan officers, get pre-approved in an hour, close in as fast as 8 days. 303-695-7000 or online at AmericanFinancing.net. Cliff May, our guest from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, is talking about the Iranian nuclear deal. So do we have the capability, or does Israel, if these things are buried, to take them out or not?
We do. We could mop them up, and I use the word mop advisedly. Massive ordnance penetrator would be one of the weapons we would use. It is a non-nuclear bunker buster, I think is another word you may have heard. Mm-hmm. It can be up to 30,000-pound bomb, and it'll cut through all the reinforced concrete and wipe it out. It would have a very, even one of those utilized against a buried nuclear weapons site would leave a very strong impression.
Okay. Let's take a phone call.
Even the credible threat to use them would leave a strong impression. That's the thing. They need to believe that these guys might actually do it.
Let's go to Dylan. Jonathan, you're on 850 KOA. What's on your mind, Jonathan?
Hey, gentlemen. This president wants an even playing field and dislikes very much our superpower status. That's the answer to your question, Mike.
Now, of course, he's never acknowledged that publicly, but you think that's his secret mentality on this? I
don't. You know what? It's not very well hidden. He's well vetted by us on the right. Anyone with common sense can read between the lines. You'd have to read between the lines, though. What I'm saying is he hasn't said that publicly. The existing understanding with the nuclear anti-proliferation treaty, which Iran is a signatory to, is that there will be no new members in the nuclear club, that a number of nations have them, but that the world is a safer place if nobody else is allowed to get them. He has never renounced the anti-proliferation treaty. I don't think it matters. Well, it may not. If that's his secret mentality, you're quite right, and I can't read his mind. But Cliff, what do you think? Well, two things. One is I agree there's a sense of moral equivalence that has been prevalent throughout the negotiations, where we're saying, and I understand the reasons for saying this, that we want to treat the Iranians with respect and as an equal, but in a way you can't, because they're going to say, fine, if we're equals, how come you have nuclear weapons and we don't? How dare you tell us we can't have them? Okay, we're saying we don't need them anyhow, but you have, but you must believe us and trust us. That's the problem. We don't have sufficient trust either in both directions. They're irrational, and their behavior proves so. And Obama's behavior, more than his words, Mike, proves so. Just look at what he's trying to do. Why hasn't he put his foot down and said no dice? But he hasn't. I am certainly. Let me just point this out. Ironically, if we go through with this deal and Iran does get a nuclear weapons either sooner or later, it is very likely to set off what they call a proliferation cascade, because already the Saudis, among others, say, look, Iran's likely to get a nuclear weapon. We have to have a nuclear weapon too. We cannot allow this. And once Iran gets it, then there's Turkey, then there are others. And if you don't think that many nations in this very chaotic and unstable part of the world getting nuclear weapons eventually leads to terrorists getting their hands on nuclear weapons, well, I think you're being overly hopeful. Yeah. Well, I certainly agree, Jonathan,
that your take on what Obama's hidden agenda is entirely plausible.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay. Thanks for your call. So, what's your prediction? Are they going to make a deal?
Boy, it's very hard to say. My prediction, if I had to bet, I would say, yeah, that Obama definitely does want a deal. But there really is a possibility that he's going to say, look, we have a deal in all but name. We can't quite sign it at this point yet. We are going to sort of agree and kind of move ahead, but we're not going to sign something. And it may be that the Iranian side decides that it doesn't want to sign something. I think all along the difficulty has been that it's not been clear whether Ayatollah Khamenei feels that he just can't sign something with the U.S., even if it's massively in his interest to do so, even if it's clear that he has a very much of a diplomatic win. Because it just seems no matter how many times we cave in, he always says, thank you, and now I have one more request. So I think it's very hard to listen. I've never said I'm great at predictions. I don't think anybody is. We don't know what the Iranians are thinking. Nobody does. Nobody's getting to report on that. If you're in Iran as a journalist, you don't have very much access, and you're pretty worried about what you're saying anyhow. So we just don't know what the Iranian thinking is. I don't think they're irrational. I think they're very rational, but I think they have a revolution that they want to advance, and they're looking at how they can best advance it, given who their enemies are, and they see an enemy that they believe is weak and in decline and wants to retreat, and their job is to give the United States a way to retreat, but to do it quickly so they can continue to do what they want to do, establish their hegemony in the Middle East, and displace the United States as a global superpower.
All right, Chris, always good to have you with us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right.